Well, we've come to the last formal presentation of our time together here.
我哋正式嘅聚會咧，差唔多都即係嘅講題都差唔多嚟到最尾一段時間，係咪？
And you may have noticed that the title is slightly different from what's in the program.
你發覺咧係唔該晒，你發覺到咧，我哋嗰個嘅打喺嗰個熒幕上嘅題目咧，同你喺節目單嗰個咧係有啲出入，係咪啊？
I was going to talk about the everlasting gospel. This one is more focused on the everlasting covenant. They're related, obviously.
本來咧，我哋又想講呢個嘅永遠嘅福音㗎，而家咧就有少少唔同，就係講個永約啦，永遠嘅約。
But in some discussions I had on Friday, I thought that this more focused presentation might be a little more helpful.
咁喺星期五晚嘅時候咧，我就發覺到咧，會唔會係咁樣改變係對大家更有幫助咧？
Because there is a lot of different ways of understanding the Bible prophecies of the Old Testament, specifically in relation to the nation of Israel.
嗱，我諗或者咧，我哋從呢一個角度咧去理解個預言咧，可能又有另一番嘅意思喎嚇。特別咧就係話咧，我哋將預言同以色列人嘅命運嚟到連埋咧，可能又有另外一種意義嘅。
So let's first sort of orient ourselves about two main views that exist today in the Christian world toward the nation of Israel.
目今咧，我哋基督教界咧對以色列人嘅睇法咧，係主要有兩個大嘅唔同嘅睇法嘅。
They're related to two different ways of looking at salvation and how God saves people.
呢兩種方法咧，就係話俾我哋聽，上帝佢嘅救贖咧係有兩個唔同嘅睇法嘅，人係對呢個上帝救贖兩個嘅睇法等等。
One view
有一種嘅睇法咧。
Let's see.
Yeah, coming up. Yeah.
Okay. Dispensational theology.
係叫做咧係時代主義嘅神學。
This is the view that basically God works with different people in different ages or dispensations.
佢係講到咧上帝嘅計劃咧係會喺唔同嘅時代，係針對唔同嘅人咧而有所改變同埋調整嘅。
And he makes covenants with them accordingly in those different dispensations.
佢亦都會係喺呢啲唔同嘅時代咧，係同人咧係立唔同嘅約嘅。
So, for example, they speak of the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and so on.
有所謂咧係同亞當立嘅約啦，上帝同挪亞立嘅約啦，同摩西立嘅約等等嘅。
But in regard to Israel, the way it is applied is that God basically has two different plans of salvation, one for Jews and one for Christians.
咁樣咧，尤其是中間最重要就係上帝對以色列人包括猶太人咁啦嘅救恩嘅方法咧，就同上帝對我哋嘅救恩方法咧係有所唔同嘅。
There's almost no overlap. These are like two totally separate or parallel systems of salvation through history.
呢兩種嘅唔同嘅睇法咧，中間咧係冇任何重疊嘅，係完全兩種喺歷史裏邊咧兩種完全唔同嘅上帝救人嘅方法嘅。
So God saves Jews in one way and he saves Christians in a different way.
即係話上帝拯救猶太人係一種方法，但係拯救以色列人咧就用另外一種方法嘅。
Covenant of grace and covenant of law.
就係所謂嘅係恩典嘅約咧，同埋律法嘅約啦。
Second approach to this is called covenantal theology.
但另一種嘅係進路咧，就叫做呢個係盟約嘅神學啦。
God has one plan.
呢種神學裏邊咧，上帝只有一種嘅計劃嘅啫。
He saves people the same way throughout all ages.
就話上帝咧，佢喺整個歷史裏邊咧，只係有一種救人嘅方法。
Same for all peoples.
同一種方法咧係拯救所有嘅人嘅。
And that plan has never changed
而呢一個咁嘅計劃咧，都一路冇改變過嘅，
because God does not change.
係因為上帝係一個唔改變嘅上帝啊嘛。
He deals with everyone on the same basis throughout history. Doesn't matter where we come from or who we are.
咁咧，上帝咧，佢對所有嘅人咧都係一致嘅，就唔會係睇下我哋係唔同嘅時代啊、唔同嘅人啦，咁就會用唔同嘅方法嚟對待我哋嘅。
So,
所以
the church then
教會係點咧？
is connected with Israel in the Bible.
嗱喺聖經裏邊咧，似乎教會同埋以色列咧有關聯，係咪？
Under this second option, there's not a strong separation between Israel and the church. There's a connection.
咁所以呢種第二種嘅睇法咧，教會同埋猶太人之間咧就冇咩太大嘅分別嘅，之間係駁住落嘅。
And we'll talk more about that.
跟住我哋會講多啲嘅。
But first, we have to understand what the Bible says about Israel itself.
不如我哋先睇下聖經點樣講以色列人啦。
And we know, of course, that this is based on God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
嗱，係基於咧上帝對亞伯拉罕、以撒、雅各嘅應許嘅喎。
And these passages, you see Abraham in yellow, and those passages in yellow are the promises to Abraham.
好啦，你見到呢度咧有啲經文係咪用黃色嘅經文咧？上面用翻黃色寫住亞伯拉罕啊，即係同佢有關嘅嗰啲經文啦。
And the off-white text refers to Isaac, Genesis 26.
咁咧白色嘅經文咧就同以撒係有關嘅。
And the orange, of course, then is reference to Jacob.
咁啊，橙色嘅嗰啲經文咧就同雅各有關嘅。
And if you compare all three of these passages, all three of these groups of passages, let's say,
如果你係比較呢三種顏色嘅經文咧，
you will find that they all speak of three basic promises that were made.
咁啊講到三個基本嘅係應許嘅喎。
First, a gift of land.
就係有關土地嘅應許嘅。
God told Abraham, walk around and see all this land I will give you.
咁啊，上帝叫我攞四圍帶住佢四圍睇就話，我會將整個呢個地咧係俾你嘅。
Second, that his descendants would be like the stars, like the sand.
佢話你嘅後代咧就會好似天上嘅星、海邊嘅沙咁多，
Really countless.
係數唔盡嘅。
Okay. And third,
第三
that
啦，
there would be a blessing. Abraham would be a blessing to the nations.
亞伯拉罕咧就會成為使萬國得福嘅一位。
Abraham and his seed.
亞伯拉罕同佢嘅後裔咧都會使萬國得福。
In you and your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. This is the
上帝
promise.
應許話咧，你藉住你同你嘅後裔咧，萬國都得福啦。
Now, this threefold promise is extremely important to keep in mind
嗱，呢三重嘅應許咧，大家要緊記住喎。
when we think about Israel,
當我哋想到以色列嘅時候咧，
because that you cannot take just one or two promises. They're a package.
你就唔可以只係將呢三個應許嘅其中一個獨立出嚟，因為佢哋係一個嘅組件嚟嘅。
Now, when we look at how these promises were fulfilled,
咁我哋嚟睇下呢三重嘅應許係點樣應驗咧？
we see Moses being given the command and connection with the entrance to the promised land, and also Joshua.
好啦，咁摩西咧就從上領受到誡命啦，然之後咧就帶佢哋去入迦南地啦，跟住有約書亞啦咁樣。
So through Moses and Joshua, this promise was brought to fulfillment.
好啦，咁啊藉住摩西、約書亞咧，咁佢哋就得地土嘅呢個應許咧就應驗咯。
In the initial sense of entering the land and conquering it.
係啦，即係喺乜嘢嘅意義裏邊嚟講咧，就係以入迦南同埋征服迦南嚟講嘅。
Now we are looking at this with a broad brush. I'm not going into all the details.
咁我哋咧嚟睇一幅嘅比較粗嘅圖畫嘅，我哋就冇話只係一睇細節啦。
Because clearly the way they entered the promised land was not God's plan A. It was his plan B.
其實咧，佢哋入迦南嘅情況咧，係唔係上帝嘅原本嘅計劃 A 嚟嘅？係某種情況之下咧，係轉咗成為計劃 B， 但係都成功咗。
You know, when they came to Kadesh Barnea, God said, go into the land.
係啦，其實咧佢哋出埃及冇幾耐咧，上帝就叫佢直接入去迦南得㗎啦。
My angel will go before you.
我嘅使者喺你前面帶路嘅，
But they sent spies,
咁佢哋就派探子去啦，係咪？
and they came back with two reports, a majority report and a minority report.
咁佢哋翻嚟咧，真係兩份嘅報告啊，一個係主流報告，一個係少數人士嘅報告。
And naturally, Israel seemed to follow the majority report.
結果後尾咧，大部分嘅以色列人就跟隨咗嗰個主流嘅報告㗎，
Which was the one that didn't believe that they could go into the land.
就係根本佢哋都唔信上帝可以成功帶領佢哋入迦南。
And then God said, well, then you're going to stay here 40 years, you're going to die here in the wilderness.
好啦，咁樣你哋就喺呢度逗留40年，就喺呢度離開呢個世界。
Your children will see.
反而你哋嘅兒女咧就會入到去迦南地。
Of course, Caleb and Joshua, the two minority reporters, were an exception to that.
係啦，咁呢兩個少數嘅報告嘅約書亞同迦勒咧就有機會咧入到迦南㗎啦。
They entered the land.
最後尾佢哋入咗呢個。
But we could, throughout this, there's much more we could say. But the time doesn't allow us to do
即
that.
係時間咧就冇法子講得太詳細啦。
Two views of Israel in prophecy.
好啦，對於預言咧，呢兩種嘅學説咧又有唔同嘅喎。
With dispensational theology, they look at prophecy as unconditional. God said it, it must be fulfilled, always.
係啦，咁咧對於嗰個時代主義咧，上帝應承咗嘅嘢咧，就一定會成功啊！無論嗰個環境點樣，係冇條件的成功嘅。
So all God's promises will be fulfilled literally.
而且咧，呢啲應驗，呢啲上帝嘅應許咧，係會照字面咁應驗嘅，
They're unconditional.
無條件嘅。
Now we'll come to that.
遲
Second,
啲我哋會嚟嘅。
all
第
the
二點啊
promises will be fulfilled literally in a restored Israel.
好啦，咁咧嗰個復興嘅，即係就算你過去好似有啲預言應驗咧，但係最後尾個復興嘅以色列咧，都會應驗晒嘅。
Now, of course, when the nation of Israel, modern nation of Israel, was established in the Middle East, dispensational theologians became very excited.
好啦，當嗰個係現代嘅所謂以色列國咧係建國嘅時候咧，就令到呢班時代主義者就好興奮啦。
This seemed like a clear fulfillment of prophecy.
咁咧就似乎咧係預言嘅好清楚嘅應驗。
The covenantal theology, on the other hand,
但係另一方面咧，嗰、個盟約嘅神學點講咧？
looks at the promises and warnings of God as always conditional.
佢哋覺得上帝嘅應許也好，佢就算話要罰你都好啦，其實都係帶有條件嘅。
Of course, the general passage we normally refer to is Jeremiah 18,
好多人咧就會引用呢個耶利米第18章。
where God says, Can I not be to you, O Israel, like the potter is to the clay?
就話咧Jeremiah
18.
OK，18 啊，what verse 啊
Okay, verse 6.
？Verse 6 OK 佢話咧，你睇下，佢同以色列人講，我對你哋就好似咧窯匠對於嗰啲泥咁啊。
God, of course, is the potter and Israel is the clay.
嗱，我咧就係窯匠噶啦。 咁你係泥嚟嘅喎，
And then he uses this. There's a principle in verses 7 and 8, I think, that we're familiar with as far as a negative promise.
耶利米18章verse 7，right？
Verse 7.
Jeremiah verse 18。
Verse 7.
18 verse 7，OK？佢話咧，我何時論到一邦或一國説，要拔出毀壞拆毀毀壞。
But notice what happens in verse 8. If, God says, I will destroy you, that nation. But if it turns from its evil, I will not.
佢話：但係如果佢哋悔改咧，離開佢哋惡咧，咁我就改變心意啦。
And likewise, verse 9, if I say I will build and plant,
但係如果我對指住一邦一國話咧，我要建立佢哋，栽種佢哋。
and that nation does evil and does not obey me,
但係如果佢哋係唔聽我話行惡咧，
I will not give the good I promised.
我就唔會照應許咁樣賜福佢哋嘅。
So here, this passage is very clear, I think, that God's promises are conditional based on the nation's response.
即係話咧，上帝嘅應許個條件係乜嘢啊？就係嗰啲國度點樣回應上帝嘅應許嘅。
Now remember, we're talking about general prophecy.
我哋曾經講過一般嘅預言係咪？
I talked on Friday about apocalyptic prophecy and that it follows a little different.
亦都講過一啲末世嘅預言，好多人用啟示啦呢個字，但我喜歡用末世嘅預言啊。咁咧就有少少唔同，呢種預言有咗唔同嘅性格嘅。
We use different principles of interpretation, and the Methods of Bible Study document goes into more detail about
係啦，當我哋解釋呢兩種預言嘅時候咧，係有所不同嘅。
Also, all the promises will be fulfilled, but they will maybe be fulfilled in a little different way based on the response of the nation and the individuals concerned.
咁呢啲預言咧，佢應驗嘅時候咧，就會相對於嗰啲接受者嘅回應有所改變嘅。
So in this case, fulfilled to what I call a reconstituted Israel.
咁於是乎咧，我哋嘅講者就話咧，佢有一個叫做咧係重建嘅以色列。
We'll have to talk more about
遲
that.
啲我哋會講㗎。
One very important consideration is how did Israel begin? Where did it begin?
好啦，咁不如我哋又嚟睇下咧，以色列人佢哋係點樣開始佢哋呢個國族嘅咧？
Anyone? Where is the origin of Israel in
以色列嘅
Scripture?
來源喺邊啊？邊位可以答我哋啊？
Jacob, exactly.
好，雅各啱啦。
Yes. This is a very important point.
嗱，好緊要嘅喎呢個嚇。
You remember that he was coming back, returning to the promised land after spending some years getting married, having children, and becoming wealthy.
係啦，咁咧雅各咧佢總之佢嘅一生好多經歷啦，之後尾佢又娶老婆又生仔，又變咗有錢。
He went out empty and came back full.
嗱，佢初去嘅狗嗰度咧就係兩手空嘅，但係翻到嚟咧係滿載而歸嘅。
But of course, it wasn't a very desirable homecoming that he anticipated.
即係雖然佢翻嚟嘅時候咧，都係有啲掙扎啦，即係唔係話即係好理想嘅情況啦嚇。
Because he had, of course, tricked Esau into selling his birthright, and then he also tricked his father in giving him the blessing.
佢又欺騙哥哥，又欺騙爸爸，咁所以咧，其實佢再翻嚟自己家鄉都係有啲即係有啲叫喺度咁嘅。
So Jacob's older twin brother was not happy.
佢嘅孖生嘅大哥咧，其實都唔係好開心嘅。
And Jacob was worried.
咁所以雅各咧就有啲擔心啦。
And of course, he had this struggle with the angel of the Lord.
結果佢就同上帝嘅使者喺度角力啦。
And he said, I will not let you go except you bless me.
佢話：我唔會俾你走，除非你祝福我。
He was aware of his sin, was repentant, and desiring God's forgiveness and blessing.
佢其實就悔改㗎啦。佢咧就係希望咧上帝會係饒恕佢，係賜福佢。
He knew he could not face Esau without God
佢
with
知
him.
道佢如果冇咗上帝咧，佢係冇辦法去面對以掃嘅。
And so he wrestled all night.
所以成晚就喺度咧掙扎㗎啦。
And of course, we know that in the end, he received the blessing he sought.
終於咧，佢係接受到呢個祝福嘅。
And his name was changed from Jacob to Israel.
結果佢就改名為以色列。
This tells us a great deal about what Israel means.
呢度已經講俾我哋聽，究竟係咩意思咧？
It is that which describes a relationship with God, a spiritual relationship.
呢度講緊一種係同神嘅屬靈嘅關係。
Jacob was a literal descendant of Abraham, no problem with
係啊，
that.
雅各真係字面上都係真係呢個嘅亞伯拉罕嘅仔孫嚟嘅喎。
He even had the promise, the older shall serve the younger.
其實一早已經預言話咧，嗰個係大嘅要服侍細噶嘛。
But he thought the promise could only be fulfilled through his trying to grab it.
咁佢諗下呢個咁嘅應許咧，可能要靠佢自己嘅掙扎先至可以應驗喎。
Not as a gift.
就唔係真係上帝一個恩賜嚟
You
嘅。
see, that's the essential problem throughout, the Bible with the covenant and the gospel. It's God's promise and it's God's gift. It's not something we can grab for ourselves.
其實整本聖經嘅約啊，呢個福音都係上帝一個恩賜，而唔係我哋自己係要靠自己去贏取翻嚟嘅嘢嚟。
And so finally, Jacob recognized this
最後尾佢明白啦，
and was converted, we would say.
佢悔改啦。
So the purpose of Israel then, as a nation, is based on this concept of spiritual relationship with God.
咁樣呢個咁嘅最後尾出到一樣嘢咧，就係佢呢個以色列嘅呢個身份咧，係基於佢同神嘅嗰個屬靈嘅關係嘅。
In Egypt already, before they left Egypt, they were they asked Pharaoh for permission to go into the wilderness to worship God.
嗱，佢喺埃及咧，佢哋就要求法老批准佢哋去曠野敬拜神。
That was their calling as God's people to worship Him.
嗱，你留意到喎，上帝呼召佢哋成為上帝嘅子民去敬拜佢。
Not only so, but to be in relationship with Him, to be a separate people, holy people.
係唔知咁，仲係要分離同埃及人分開咧，成為聖潔嘅子民嘅。
And Exodus 19, verses 4 to 6, very important passage. One of the most important in the Old Testament to understand who Israel is.
咁樣咧，埃及19章4到6節咧就講明啦，佢要被呼召出嚟成為一個聖潔嘅國度啊嘛。
the microphone?
Oh, is this not working? Okay,
Sorry，
that's all right. Somehow I thought this was working, but okay. So they were called to be His people, God's people,
嗱咁樣佢哋就會被稱為上帝嘅子民嘅，
His holy nation,
佢有聖潔嘅國度嘅。
and to show forth His righteousness, who He is, to be to proclaim His goodness.
就去彰顯上帝嘅公義，係去話俾人聽上帝係點嘅。
Of course, you'll recognize that this is also quoted by Peter in the New Testament.
咁你留意到咧喺彼得嗰度咧都有提嘅，彼得書信都有提嘅。
But the whole purpose of God bringing them out of Egypt was to worship Him and to be His people.
嗱，總的嚟講啦，上帝呼召佢哋出嚟埃及曠野，就成為佢嘅聖潔嘅子民去敬拜佢嘅。
Was Israel's existence conditional?
咁樣以色列佢繼續存在有冇條件嘅咧？
What would you say?
你覺得點啊？
Could they disappear?
佢哋會唔會被上帝所丟棄咧？
Well, let's look at Romans chapter 11.
睇下羅馬11章咧。
Here, Paul deals with the very important question about the nation.
好啦，保羅喺呢度咧就講到關於以色列啦。
He has just talked about how Israel has stumbled at the stumbling stone at the end of chapter 9, that they want to establish their own righteousness and not receive God's righteousness.
講到咧猶太人、以色列人佢哋就想建立自己嘅義啊，而唔係靠上帝。
And in chapter 10, verse 21, the last verse, all day long to Israel, God says, all day long I have stretched out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people.
佢話關於以色列人咧，佢話我整日向呢個悖逆頂嘴嘅民招手啊！
And so Paul asks the logical question, has God cast away his people?
跟住咧，保羅就問啦：咁樣上帝有冇棄住佢嘅百姓咧？
And what's the answer?
答案係咩啊？
Certainly not.
並冇喎，
Very strong denial that God has
好
cast away
強
his
咁話
people.
絕對沒有。
Now, on what basis does he say that?
不過保羅跟住乜嘢咁講？
Notice the very next phrase in verse 1.
留意跟住嗰句咯喎。
For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin.
佢話其實我都係以色列人，係亞伯拉罕嘅後裔便雅憫嘅支派嘅。
Okay? Paul was a Jew,
保羅都係一個猶太人，
but not just any Jew.
唔係就係普通猶太人，
He was a believer in Jesus.
佢係一個信耶穌嘅猶太人。
And that's a key point.
嗱，呢個就係一個嗰個關鍵。
So Paul is an example of those whom God has not cast off.
呢個就係上帝並冇棄絕以色列呢個例證。
Notice verse 29.
好，我哋睇下29節。
For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable.
佢話因為上帝嘅恩賜同選召係不會撤回嘅。
There was no question in God's plan that Israel would succeed.
喺上帝嘅計劃當中咧係冇問題嘅，以色列人一定會成功嘅。
They were to be a blessing for the world.
佢哋真係會成為世人嘅福氣嘅，
And that is unconditional.
係無條件嘅。
The only condition or question is who will compose Israel?
問題就係、以色列係包括啲咩人咧？
Now that is a different matter.
嗱咁就唔同啦。
Who belongs to Israel?
邊啲人先至係屬於以色列人咧？
And that's conditional.
呢、個就係所謂嘅條件性。
In verses 22 and 23, Paul quotes Hosea.
喺呢個嘅11章係嘛？11章第22節嗰度開始咧，保羅就引用何西阿書啦。
Actually, the quotation of Hosea is a little bit earlier.
其實仲先頭就已經有㗎啦。
In chapter 9, verses 25 and 26.
第9章29 29 and verse 29 and verse
25 and 26.
25 and 26啊。9章26 25節開始，佢話咧，正如何西阿講嘅咧，嗱本來唔係我子民嘅，我要稱為我嘅子民；本來唔係蒙愛嘅，稱為蒙愛嘅，等等。
God had, in a way, kind of separated himself from Israel because of their disobedience. The northern kingdom was destroyed.
某種情況之下咧，上帝同以色列人咧就保持一個距離。
And he said, "You are not my people."
嗱，你唔再係我子民啦，北方
Amazing,
係被擄啦，
amazing language.
係好奇怪一種講法係咪？
And I am not your God.
我唔再係你嘅上帝啦。
But here, then, in Hosea, he promises restoration.
但係喺何西阿書佢係應許會重新恢復嘅喎。
But it is also includes Gentiles, as Paul makes clear.
但係喺呢個恢復裏邊咧，係包括埋外邦人嘅喎。
And that's why I will call them my people who were not my people.
我會稱嗰啲本來唔係我子民嘅人做我子民。
So it's conditional on our response.
嗱，所以咧，當我哋回應呢啲應許嘅時候咧，都係有條件。
Jeremiah 7, verse 23, God says, "Obey my voice, I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you."
耶利米又話咧：你哋要離棄惡道，係聽從我，咁就做我子民。
Now, this is not obey in order to become my people.
嗱，你記住啊，唔係你因為你聽上帝話，所以你被揀選出嚟做上帝子民喎。
If you continue to obey, you will continue to be my people.
但係你要繼續做我子民咧，你就要聽話喎。
You see, God called Israel into existence. This is a gift, remember, gift of grace, as with Jacob.
上帝喺萬民當中揀選雅各嘅後裔咧，係無條件嘅，係一個恩賜。
As with Abraham and Isaac,
亞伯拉罕、以撒、雅各都係咁，
it's a gift.
係一個恩賜。
Now, we often talk about the land of Israel.
好啦，我哋時時講到以色列地，
But whose land is it according to the Bible?
根據聖經，呢塊迦南地係
It
邊個
was not theirs. It was not Israel's land.
原來呢一笪地唔係以色列地嚟嘅，
It was, in fact, God's land.
係上帝自己嘅地，
It's called the land of the Lord.
係話上主嘅地。
And we therefore find how that is to be handled.
好啦，咁樣點樣處理呢個問題呢？
It was a holy land.
係一個聖地，
It's holy because it belongs to God, not anyone else. It's His land.
因為佢係屬於上帝嘅，所以佢係聖潔。
And because it's holy and because it belongs to God, it was to keep Sabbath even.
因為佢係聖地，係屬於上帝，所以裏邊嘅人要守安息日。
It was to rest every 7 years. They were not to plant.
仲有每第7年都要休息，讓個地休息。
And it could not be permanently sold.
你唔可以係咁啊撒種嘅喎。
If it was sold, there were specific provisions for it to be redeemed or bought back.
對唔住，你唔可以永遠賣斷一個地嘅，你買咗之後咧，你要贖翻佢翻嚟嘅喎。
It could not be permanently sold.
你唔可以係永遠賣斷你嘅地嘅。
And even if it could not be bought back by anyone, at the time of Jubilee, it was to be returned.
就算你冇本事贖翻個地，去到第50年禧年嘅時候咧，嗰塊地都自動俾翻你嘅。
So these were the rules that God made for His land.
嗱，呢個就係上帝係為佢自己嘅地所定嘅律啦。
I think probably, people here in Hong Kong can understand this.
佢話我哋香港人可能會容易明白。
It's not an exact parallel, but Hong Kong belongs to China.
我哋中國咧係回歸，香港回歸中國。
It was leased for a while by another
system.
Another country, another nation. But it didn't belong to that nation.
即係我哋雖然有50年嘅經濟不變，但係我哋仍然係屬於中國噶嘛。
It belonged to China.
係啊，我哋香港係屬於中國噶嘛。
And when China wanted it back, well,
當中國要攞翻咁就係中國噶啦。
it returned.
就回歸啦。
So something like that.
其實有啲類似咁樣。
It's not an exact parallel.
係當然有啲唔同啦，但係你可以聯想到係咪？
It was residence in the land was conditional on obedience.
嗱，所以生活喺呢笪地上嘅人咧，佢哋都要係以服從作為條件嘅。
That you could stay in the land as long as you remained God's holy people.
只有你繼續係成為上帝嘅聖民嘅時候，你先可以住喺聖地。
Remember our definition of Israel.
嗱，明白以色列嘅定義係咩嘛？
And how it was created.
佢最初點樣被建立㗎？
It's a created people.
佢哋係一班即係上帝突然間選嘅人嚟嘅喎，唔係自己搞出嚟嘅喎。
Created by God.
係上帝自己設立嘅一樣嘢嚟嘅喎。
And so if you are willing and obedient, God says, you will eat the good of land.
嗱，如果你繼續順從咧，你就可以食嗰個地嘅出產啦。
But if you refuse and rebel, you will be devoured with the sword.
你如果係唔聽話咧，刀劍就會臨到你哋。
Isaiah 1:19
以賽亞書1章9節，19節
and 20.
20節。
So they could stay if they obeyed. If they didn't, they wouldn't. That simple.
嗱，你聽唔聽話，咁就你留唔留得低啊？咁簡單啫。
And of course, we know that that's Israel's history.
但事實上係咁啊嘛，歷史係咁啊嘛。
They did not obey and they did not stay.
結果佢哋係冇順從就被流放到其他地。
Northern kingdom was wiped away.
首先係北國被即係擄走去嘅。
Babylon invaded the southern kingdom and eventually destroyed Jerusalem and the temple.
好啦，跟住輪到巴比倫人嚟到圍攻呢個耶路撒冷，結果就滅咗佢。
But that history was not totally dark.
不過咁嘅歷史唔係完全黑暗嘅。
Because God still planned something for Israel.
不過上帝對以色列咧仲有一啲計劃。
His calling was unconditional.
因為佢嘅呼召係無條件嘅。
Okay, well, that generation it didn't work, but maybe the next generation.
OK，咁上一批嘅人咧係唔忠心，或者新一批嘅人忠心咧。
And so there was hope of a return to the land.
所以咧就希望佢哋復國嘅時候又唔同。
Isaiah 10:20 and 21.
所以以賽亞書第10章20到22節嗰度咧，到21節嗰度咧。
It shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as has escaped of the house of Jacob will never again depend on him who defeated them, but will depend on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. 10,
chapter 10,
verse 20.
verse 20, OK。10章第20節咧，佢話到那日咧，以色列所剩下嘅或者餘民啦，係嘛，同埋雅各家所逃脫嘅咧，必不再倚靠那擊打他們的，卻要誠心仰賴耶和華以色列嘅聖者。
And notice especially verse 21.
第11節。
The remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God.
所剩下雅各家嘅餘民就要歸回全能嘅上帝。
It's not just a return to the land.
嗱，唔係淨係翻去嗰個地喎。
You study the Hebrew word shuv through the Old Testament is clearly envisioned a spiritual return, a return to God, a return to His ways.
其實更重要嘅係一個屬靈嘅回歸，回歸翻同上帝嗰種生活方式。
And a coming king would establish righteousness.
一位將要嚟嘅王咧，就要建立公義。
Jeremiah 23.
耶利米23章。
A branch of David, verse 5. And in verse 6, he's called the Lord our righteousness.
Verse 6 right?
Yes.
喺佢嘅日子咧，猶大必得救，以色列都安然居住，佢嘅名要稱為耶和華我們的義。
Of the line of David,
係跟住大衛嗰條線嘅
which verse 5 refers to.
verse 啊，要邊嘅？
The previous verse refers to.
啊，即係之前參考之前嘅。
So, now let's notice a little bit more about this figure.
嗱，我哋再留意一下呢個象徵，好冇？
In Isaiah,
喺以賽亞書啦，
there are a number of songs that are called the servant songs.
嗱有一啲咧稱為僕人之詩嘅，
About God's servant, he calls him my servant.
佢稱佢哋為我的僕人。
And at first, this servant seems to be equal to the nation of Israel.
開始嘅時候咧，你覺得呢個上帝嘅義僕咧，就係同以色列國係同等嘅。
Isaiah 41, verse 8.
以賽亞書41章第8節，以賽亞書41章第8節唯有你以色列咧係我嘅僕人，雅各我所揀選，我朋友亞伯拉罕嘅後裔。
So, clearly, descendant of Abraham refers to the nation, it seems.
係咪啊？就亞伯拉罕嘅後裔就係佢呢個國啦。
And then we also see in chapter 42, verses 19 and 20,
好啦，到42章咧係19、20節咯喎。42章19節咧，佢話：誰俾我啲僕人眼瞎咧？誰俾我所差嘅使者耳聾咧？誰瞎眼好似個獻身俾我嘅人啦？等等等等，有一個僕人。
that this servant is blind and deaf.
你竟然信呢個僕人係盲又聾嘅。
Verse 20, seeing many things, but you do not observe, opening the ears, but he does not hear.
點知咧？你有眼睇唔到嘅，有耳仔聽唔到嘅。
This is also quoted by Jesus,
係耶穌亦都引用呢啲嘅經文。
or alluded to. There's also an earlier reference in Isaiah 6, a similar.
亦都係之前咧，以賽亞書6章亦都有類似嘅講法。
Hearing, but closing your ears and closing your eyes, lest they be converted. Turn.
就話我要使到佢哋咧睇唔見，聽唔見，免得佢哋回頭回轉過來，我醫治佢哋。
The word in that verse, by the way, is shuv again, return, lest they be returned and be converted.
嗱講嚟講咧，都係提到佢回唔回頭嘅、回唔回轉嘅問題。
But as we read through the servant songs, it becomes clear that it cannot just be Israel as a nation referred to.
嗱，當我哋繼續睇呢啲僕人之詩咧，睇下咧，好似唔係淨係講以色列，又講到另外一啲嘢嘅喎。
Because Isaiah 49 verses 1 to 5 talk about how this servant will bring Jacob back and gather Israel back to God.
好啦，咁佢去到49章嚟講呢個僕人咧，佢會將猶大以色列帶翻嚟嘅。
Verse 6.
好，49章第6節。佢話：你做我個僕人，使雅各眾支派復興，使以色列中蒙保存嘅人歸回等等。
So, not only Israel, but even a light to the
唔
Gentiles.
止啊，跟住佢話咧，甚至要成為外邦人嘅光。
So, this servant is not the nation because he's bringing the nation back to God.
所以呢個僕人咧，佢本身唔係嗰個國，而係嗰個將呢個國帶翻嚟上喺嗰度嗰個人。
At the same time, it's also to be a light to the Gentiles, that the salvation of God might stretch to the ends of the earth.
而且佢會成為外邦嘅光嘅，一路傳到去地極。
And in Isaiah 53,
好啦，以賽亞書第53章啦，
he is cut off.
佢話佢咧俾人哋係剪除喎。
And at the end of verse 8, for the transgressions of my people he was stricken.
第8節以賽亞書53章第8節下半句，因為佢從活人之地被剪除，為我百姓嘅罪過，佢被帶到死地。
So obviously, if it's for the transgression of God's people Israel, it cannot equal Israel. It's a servant separate in some way from Israel itself as
即係
a
話，
nation.
如果呢個僕人咧係為以色列人死咧，佢本身就唔可能係以色列人嘅，唔可能以色列國咯。
And that this, because he dies for Israel's sin, as Israel's representative, he would be exalted.
佢咧係因為要嚟救贖以色列人咧，佢自己就被剪除啦。
We're kind of racing through these prophecies. Much more could be said.
嗱，你睇下呢個預言講得係咪好清楚啊？
Ezekiel 37,
以西結啦，37章啦，
a very familiar passage.
好出名一段啊。
Israel sees a valley of dry bones.
以色列咧被形容為一啲枯乾嘅骨頭喎。
but not just dry, very dry.
唔係乾啊，係乾到痹啊！
And God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live?
咁跟住上帝就問以西結啦：呢啲咁乾嘅骨頭可唔可以復活咧？
Well, he's not going to say no, but he doesn't know how he can say yes.
佢又唔識得答話唔係，但係佢亦唔知點樣答係。
Lord, you know.
個主啊，你知道。
And then, of course, God promises that, and Ezekiel sees before him what happens. These bones start coming together, and then flesh and everything start, and being put on it, and then spirit is breathed into them.
係啦，咁跟住咧，佢睇到異象咧，上帝就將呢啲咁嘅撈亂骨頭咧，就冚唪唥砌翻好佢，然之後咧冚埋，將啲皮冚上去，然後吹啖氣，佢就變翻活人啦。
And they stand up and a great mighty army.
咁佢哋呢啲枯骨就企起身成為一大隊軍隊喎。
What an amazing picture of death to resurrection and life.
係一幅何等嘅圖畫，係由死變成復活變成係好生氣嘅。
Of course, Ezekiel witnessed the destruction of Israel.
其實以西結佢親眼睇住以色列國嘅敗亡噶嘛，
He saw the devastation.
佢睇到佢嗰啲枯骨點樣枯噶嘛。
And he also was promised its restoration.
但係而家竟然應許咧呢啲會翻生嘅。
That there would be one kingdom united under one king.
跟住咧呢兩個本來分裂過咧，會變翻一個國，係喺一個王嘅統治之下。
But Israel's death and resurrection
以色列嘅死同復活咧，
is also for a purpose.
但係都有個目的嘅喎。
This resurrected or new Israel
呢個咁嘅復活嘅新嘅以色列，
would teach the nations.
要教導萬國。
And in fact would have its doors open for the nations to join it.
係會打開門，係歡迎其他嘅民族加入佢哋以色列。
You look at Isaiah 66, there's even the promise that some could be part of the priesthood.
佢話咧係呢個嘅以賽亞66章咧，有啲祭司咧亦都會翻嚟嘅，
And offer sacrifices.
會獻祭嘅，
So no limitations
冇
in
限
this
制
new
嘅，
Israel.
係一個新嘅以色列。
Nowhere does prophecy envision the reconstitution of Israel as a secular state.
嗱，你睇清楚，所有呢啲關於未來以色列嘅預言，冇一個係指緊屬世嘅以色列國。
You see, Israel was meant to be a light to the nations, a light to the Gentiles,
嗱，佢講到以色列成為萬國之光喎，
to teach them
係會教導萬民嘅喎，
that through them all the nations of the earth would be blessed.
所以萬國會得福嘅喎。
And the only way that could be is if they were God's people. If they obeyed Him and if they were separated from the practices of the nations as His holy people.
嗱，但係個條件咧，一定要佢脱離其他民族嗰啲嘅習俗，然後成為上帝聖潔嘅子民。
Now, if you look at Israel today, does Israel fit this description?
我哋睇下今日嘅以色列啱唔啱聖經記載咧？
It doesn't. It's been struggling with this for over half a century now, this problem. There are some that want it to be a holy nation.
係啊，佢係好想成為聖潔國度，但係事實上成為麻煩嘅製造者咯。
And they sometimes have taken drastic, violent measures to try to make that happen.
佢哋係唔係用教導人嘅方法，而係用武力逼迫人嘅方法，想成就上帝嘅應許。
But Israel, when it was established and according to its constitution, is a secular nation.
你睇下今日以色列嗰個嘅憲法，佢其實係一個世俗嘅國家嚟。
There's coexistence of many religions.
佢哋係同好多宗教都有關聯嘅。
Of course, you've got not just Judaism, but Christianity and Islam all coexisting in the nation of
其實喺呢
Israel.
塊地裏邊，猶太教、基督教、天主教、東正教、回教乜嘢都喺齊到嘅。
And so the current existing state could not be the holy people that God has in mind.
所以你睇下而家嘅以色列國裏面根本就唔會係上帝呢個聖潔子民咯，
Because it's established as a secular nation.
因為佢本來就係要以一個世俗國度嘅身份嚟到被建立嘅。
But Israel, as we saw through the servant songs of Isaiah,
但係以色列喺應驗呢個以賽亞嘅僕人之歌嗰裏邊嚟講咧，
dies and is resurrected and exalted.
佢咧就係死而復活被高舉。
that Israel as a people may be resurrected and exalted.
係啦，佢哋作為人民咧，佢哋被復活同埋高舉嘅。
And this is where we come, of course, to the new covenant.
好啦，而家嚟到一個跟住個觀念咧，叫新約啦。
A new Israel requires a new covenant.
一個新嘅以色列咧，就需要個新約嘅喎。
As the representative of Israel, Jesus lived and died and was resurrected.
作為新以色列嘅代表咧，耶穌真係死咗、復活咗，同埋被高舉嘅。
We could go into detail about how Matthew makes this very vividly clear.
我哋其實可以花時間去睇下馬太佢點樣係好仔細交代呢件事。
Talks about how Jesus, as a child, was taken into Egypt
佢講到耶穌童年嘅時候被帶到去埃及，
and brought back out,
然後被帶翻出嚟，
that the prophecy might be fulfilled, the Hosea's prophecy,
以
I
至
think it's
何西阿書
11:1.
嘅預言可以應驗。
Out of Israel have I called my son.
佢話：我要呼召我兒係出嚟埃及。
Now some scratch their heads and say, how can that apply to Jesus? That's talking about the nation.
啊，唔係啊！啲人話何西阿係講唔好理由講耶穌嘅，講緊成個由以色列國喎。
But you see, as representative of the nation, Jesus fulfills the purpose of God where Israel failed.
作為以色列嘅代表咧，耶穌成就咗肉體以色列失敗嘅嘢。
And he ratified the covenant with better sacrifice.
佢係認準咗呢個咧係嗰個嘅同嗰個嘅新約係用佢自己嘅更好嘅犧牲嚟。
And so Hebrews 9 verse 15 says that even the sins committed under the first covenant
希伯來書話咧，嗰個前約係咁樣去認準嘅。
were redeemed by Jesus.
但係而家咧呢個新嘅約咧就係由耶穌個血去認準嘅，
It wasn't the animal sacrifices.
唔係用動物嘅血。
As Dr. D'Souza pointed out very clearly from the Old Testament, that the animal sacrifices were not some kind of payment for sin.
好似頭先我哋講啦，係嘛？就唔係話咧係俾錢去贖罪嘅，
They were an expression of faith
係憑信心嘅，
and obedience.
係信服嘅。
Those two are really never separate.
其實信服同埋係信心係分唔到嘅。
True faith is always an obedient faith.
真正嘅信心永遠係一個服從嘅信心。
And through the process of bringing a sacrifice, it would be forgiven. The sin would be forgiven. Passive voice.
其實嗰個獻祭咧係一個儀式，真正赦免人嘅嗰個係上帝，
It would be forgiven by God
係上帝赦免。
based on the promise of the coming real sacrifice.
係基於嗰個應許要嚟嘅真正嘅犧牲，呢啲動物不過係嗰個象徵啫。
And through whom only forgiveness could be achieved, could be received.
只有嗰個真正嘅犧牲，我哋先可以得到赦免同埋救贖嘅。
Because the blood of animals could never take away sins, it says in Hebrews.
正係因為咁嘅緣故咧，嗰個血係唔可以救人。May I ask a very important question among us? Sorry for interrupt you. Since you are talking about the blood of an animal cannot really clean, it's only a symbol, okay? Today, somebody struggle on the baptism. They follow the Catholic and the Lutheran to say that without baptism, nobody can be saved. Is that true?
Well, it's a good question.
Similar, right?
It's a similar question. Let's postpone that question. It's a little bit involved. Let's postpone that question for the question and answer time.
Yeah, okay.
But it's a very good question.
Extract that.
Okay.
因為頭先提到咧，有啲人以為咧動物血可以洗罪嘛，同樣今日都有啲人以為係個洗禮咧可以洗罪嘅。咁佢話呢個非常相類似嘅問題，就留翻一陣間係問答問題解答先答好嘛。
I think what I have to say about baptism in just a few minutes, it will help explain. Maybe you could translate that.
遲啲佢都會講到關於洗禮嘅嚇。
Okay, so let's talk about now a little bit more the new covenant.
好啦，而家繼續講多啲關於新約啦。
According to Romans 4,
羅馬書第4章，
Abraham's descendants are determined on a spiritual basis.
亞伯拉嘅後裔咧，而家變成一個咧係以屬靈為基礎嘅嘞噃。
Even Abraham himself received God's gift of righteousness before he was circumcised, Paul says.
呢個亞伯拉咧喺佢自己未曾受過禮之前，就已經被稱義啦。
And so the promise could not rest on a physical descent and physical circumcision.
所以作為真正上帝嘅子民咧，唔係靠嗰個嘅肉體嘅割禮嘅，
It's based on spiritual basis.
其實係呢個割禮所象徵個屬靈嘅關係。
Verse 16.
16節4章 chapter 4 right？
Yes, chapter 4, the last part. So it's to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all.
OK， 唔單止係歸給嗰個屬於律法嘅，亦都歸給嗰個效法亞伯拉罕之信嘅人嘅。
And then Paul explains what that faith consists of in the next verse.
嗱咁跟住咧，保羅就進一步解釋啦。
He believed in the God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as existing.
亞伯拉罕就係嗰個佢所信嘅就係嗰個叫死人復活、使無變有嘅上帝啊！
So again, God who brings life from the dead.
係上帝叫人從死裏得返。
Of course, that was prefigured already in Abraham's faith that even if God would require Isaac as a sacrifice, he could raise him from the dead.
係啦，亞伯拉罕佢相信，就算佢獻咗以撒為祭咧，上帝都可以叫佢復活嘅。
Hebrews makes that clear.
希
Hebrews
伯來書講得
11.
好清楚，係咪？
And even at Isaac's birth, the same. Paul talks about the deadness of Sarah's womb. God was able to bring life.
嗱，其實以撒出世咧都好似復活咁㗎，佢由一個死咗嘅子宮嗰度咧，嗰個撒拉嘅子宮嗰度咧，突然間走個人出嚟啊！
This is, of course, symbolic of the death and resurrection that God would bring life to us through Jesus'
嗱，所以
sacrifice.
呢一切咧都係象徵緊上帝藉住耶穌嘅死而復活，將生命帶俾我哋嘅，
Faith in him,
係喺佢裏面嘅信心，
just as Abraham expressed faith
就好似亞伯拉罕佢嘅信心嘅表達一樣，
in the coming Messiah.
係對嗰位要嚟嘅彌賽亞。
And Paul makes clear in Galatians chapter 3
保羅喺呢個嘅加拉太書第3章亦都好清楚嘅，
that Christ is the seed
Come on.
of Abraham.
基督就係嗰個亞伯拉罕嘅後嗣嗰個種啊
Verse 16,
chapter
Verse 16.
OK 3章16節加拉太。
To Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He does not say, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ.
第16節佢話：那些應許原是向亞伯拉罕同佢後裔講嘅，並唔係話眾後裔，而係話嗰個後裔一個人就係基督。
Christ is the seed of Abraham. He is the one who was promised already in Genesis 3:15.
呢個創世記3章15節嗰個女人嘅後裔，亦都就係呢度亞伯拉罕嘅後裔，
The seed of the woman
就係嗰女人就係因為基督，
would crush the serpent's head.
嗰位會打碎蛇嘅頭嘅。
And so, as we've seen in the Old Testament prophecies, he was the representative of Israel, dying, being resurrected.
其實就係呢個基督，佢先就係以色列嘅代表，死而復活。
And therefore, we can receive the promise as we are baptized into Christ.
好啦，咁我哋就得到呢個應許咧，藉住洗禮進入基督裏邊。
You see, no longer is circumcision the determining factor of belonging to the people of God.
好啦，而家嗰個象徵屬於上帝子民嘅咧，已經唔再係割禮啦，
It's baptism.
係洗禮啦。
That's a very significant difference
嗱，好重要嘅分別嘅喎，
because in baptism,
因為喺洗禮裏邊啦，
there is, as Paul says,
好似保羅講啦，
no more, you see in verse 28, this famous verse,
which chapter
3.
3章28
There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ
不
Jesus.
分猶太人或者希臘人啊，唔再分奴僕或者主人男女，因為你哋喺基督裏面都成為咗一啦。
How?
點樣咧？
Through baptism, as the previous verse
就係好
mentions.
似前面所講嘅，藉住洗禮啦。
That's how we become united to Christ and belong to Him.
咁樣我哋就同基督合一啦，喺基督裏面合一啦。
And then the next verse says, And if you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise.
既然你哋屬於基督，你哋就係亞伯拉罕嘅仔孫，照住應許成就產業嘅。
So Paul understands, the Hebrew ambiguity of seed, of one and many.
係啦，呢個咧就係保羅點樣理解咧一個人同一班人之間嗰個異同點。
Through Christ, we can become part of that seed, collective seed.
藉住基督，我哋會成為亞伯拉罕後裔嘅一部分。
So we're out of time. I'll just come to some conclusions. The church is the continuity of the Israel of God.
嗱，結論就係、教會就係嗰個以色列嘅延續。
Just like Paul, you see, he in Romans 11:1, he says, I too am of the seed of Abraham.
所以保羅
Tribe
佢
of
喺羅馬書話：
Benjamin.
我本身都係以色列嘅一個後裔嚟㗎。
So he's an example of this continuity.
但係因為佢係基督徒嘛，咁所以佢就解釋咗乜嘢叫新以色列啦。
As he says in Romans 9 also, they are not all Israel that are of Israel.
好似羅馬書9章話，唔係因為你肉體以色列人，你就真係以色列人㗎喎。
And the church does not displace Israel.
教會咧，佢其實就唔係因為咧有教會咁就咧係冇咗以色列。
So it's not like Israel died and the church then takes its place.
唔係話咧係以色列從此冇咗啦，咁咧就教會就代替以色列啦。
There is a continuity
其
through
實當中
Christ
有個連續性嘅。
and being united to him. He also was of the seed of Abraham, of the seed of David, right? As we see in Matthew's genealogy.
嗰個連續點咧就係好似基督啊、保羅呢啲人咧就係嗰個同時兩邊身份嘅人嚟嘅。
And so the church is a continuity of Israel, not the displacement or replacement of Israel.
所以咧唔係話以色列突然間斷咗有完全新嘅一個教會咁，唔係咁樣。
Unbelieving Jewish branches were cut off.
冇錯，嗰啲唔相信嘅以色列人咧就被剪除啦。
Believing Gentile branches were grafted in.
係啦，嗰啲信嘅外邦人咧就接入嚟啦。
And there's only one Israel in the New Testament.
但係喺新約裏邊得一個以色列嘅啫，
One flock with one shepherd.
一群嘅羊，一個嘅牧人。
Jesus said, Other sheep I have not of this fold. I have to bring them, and there will be one flock and one shepherd.
雖然之外仲有啲羊，但係我會將佢哋帶埋加入埋啲群。
So Jews and Gentiles together.
結果外邦人、猶太人就成為一體啦。
Natural and wild branches in one olive tree.
嗰個原生嘅葡萄樹咧，同嗰個野生嘅葡萄樹就合而為一啦。
One spiritual temple
一個屬靈嘅殿，
composed of Jews and Gentiles, Ephesians 2.
猶太人同外邦人一齊建成嘅。
And one eschatological virgin, Revelation 12.
一個嘅係末世性嘅呢個嘅童女啊，好似啟示錄講嘅。
And of course, New Jerusalem epitomizes this. The city is a symbol of God's people.
呢個新嘅耶路撒冷咧，就會為所有歷代上帝嘅以色列而預備嘅，
Of all ages,
係歷代嘅。
with the foundation of the tribes and the gates of the city.
你會睇到嗰個嘅根基啦，嗰啲柱子啦，咁成個城嘅
12 tribes and 12 apostles.
係啦，咁樣就係呢個就係新嘅耶路撒冷。